Should I start with a cyber joke?
Is that a trick question? Do you have a cyber joke? Is it a dad joke?
It is a cyber joke, and it is a bit of a dad joke.
I mean, hit me. That's
Why did the hacker break up with the Wi-Fi? Because they just couldn't find a secure connection.
oh, that actually hurts my soul so much.
Welcome back, everyone, to another edition of the Road to Resilience podcast, where we explore new ideas, get to know new leaders in the resilience space, and learn more about the real world lessons that are shaping more resilient communities across the nation. I'm your co host, John Ray. A little bit about me for those first time listeners. I'm a crisis management thought leader. I'm the founder of Florida Resilience Group and currently serving as the emergency manager for the city of Fort Worth, Texas. Joining us today is CJ Dixon. He's a cybersecurity professional who helps bridge the gap between technical risk and public trust. In this episode, we plan to unpack how cybersecurity connects to community resilience and what leaders need to understand to prepare for the threats we can't always see coming. As always, my trusted partner, Ashley Harrigan, is also here today to help lead this important discussion with CJ. Ashley, the floor is all yours.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be back for another episode. So I'm going to go ahead and provide an introduction for CJ so we can get started. I think it really helps to ground the episode by knowing who CJ is, what he does, and what he stands for. CJ has a knack for making the complex clear. He started off as a U.S. Army psychological operations officer, where he designed and executed influence campaigns across West Africa, which gave him a new perspective on human behavior, messaging framing, and social change. And then, after almost a decade of military service, CJ did strategic communication and emerging technology and cyber security initiatives at the Department of Homeland Security for New York City Cyber Command and Deloitte. And today he works as a senior vice president for growth and partnerships at MNC Saatchi Worldwide Services, where he's continuing to bridge behavioral insight with creative execution, helping mission driven organizations and global brands drive impact at scale. He is known for his commitment to mentorship and team development, and his leadership philosophy is simple. It's combining data with empathy, creativity with rigor, and strategy with story. And if that isn't storied enough, he is also the founder of Griot Global with the clear mission that marketing is going to make the world a better place. So, with all of that knowledge and experience making tech accessible, I think we have a good person to have a cyber discussion today without our audience being too overwhelmed. So, CJ, welcome.
Thanks a lot, Ashley and John. Thank you both for having me on this episode. And I'm very excited to talk to you all about cybersecurity, cyber's role in resilience, and how everyday people might be able to think a little bit differently about the technology that they use every day. So, very excited.
Okay, so for the purposes of getting started, I think it would help. We just went through your bio, but if you could tell us a little bit more about your background and how you've built community throughout your career.
So, yeah, happy to give a bit of my background, a little bit more than what you provided, which I thought was a great overview. And as your audience might suspect listening to that, I haven't had a straight line in the start of my career to where I am now. I didn't start off in the technology space. I didn't start off as a cyber professional. I didn't start off in marketing. I didn't start off as a psychological operations officer. Younger CJ actually started off as a medical service corps officer. And for the folks that are in the know, that is basically the Army's description for what is a medical emergency management professional. So I started off actually doing medical logistics, and my first deployment in 2010 to 2011, that was my primary mission was medical logistics in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation New Dawn. And then when I got back, I actually switched slightly to what we call an area support medical hospital. And all that really is, it's a field hospital. And my organization, my unit, we were responsible for emergency medical management in support of civilian agencies during a catastrophic incident. And back in 2012, in a simpler time, if you will, the big thing that everybody was most concerned about was chemical, biological, nuclear, and radiological risk from non-state actors getting a hold of stuff that we would not want them to have and then dropping it on unsuspecting civilian populations. So that's actually where I started my career, which is pretty adjacent to emergency management, the conversation we're having today. From then, I moved on to special operations to be a psychological operations officer. I can give you the Army's preferred description of what that is, but I am no longer in the Army, so I don't have to. So what that really is it's military propaganda and counter propaganda. Or if you prefer a less muscular description of it, it's what happens when you apply marketing techniques to a military problem set. The whole purpose is to get a group of people in a combat zone or combatant command to take some sort of action behavior that is beneficial to the United States and the military's mission in that given area of operations, if you will. Um, from there, I actually decided to leave the Army right about 10 years of service, went back to grad school, and discovered accidentally that I had a bit of a knack for computer technology. And there was always an interest for me when I was doing psychological operations because there was an emerging intersection between psychological operations and computer technology. E.g., how do you do PSYOP in the era of social media? What can your computer do for you in psychological operations that you could not do prior to the ubiquity of digital technology? So that led me to a couple of classes in cyber, which led me to sort of falling backwards into the cyber profession, where I got my first cyber job, and that the rest is kind of history. I went from New York City to Deloitte doing cyber. Then I got the call to come help the Department of Homeland Security develop cyber policy, and that's actually where Ashley, you and I met back in 2022 when I first showed up on the scene as the cyber policy advisor at DHS. And from there, I moved on to my current role at MNC Saatchi World Services. They are a traditional marketing agency. World Service happens to be the part of that marketing agency that provides support to democratically elected governments. And I mean democratically elected in the global sense of the word, not the American sense of Democrats and Republicans, but governments that were elected duly by their citizens. We provide services to those types of governments. And part of my value proposition was I could bridge that gap between what a marketer does and what digital technology allows you to do. So the short version of that is I like to say that I'm a creative that sort of fell backwards into a career in cybersecurity, and that brings us this conversation today.
So, CJ, one of the things that we like to do on the podcast is we ask somewhat of a recurring question for all of our guests. And we would like to know, inquiring minds would like to know, how do you define resilience?
So I've come up with a pretty simple definition a few years ago that I keep in my head when having this conversation. But the short version is resilience to me is the ability to take a punch and then keep on doing what you're supposed to be doing in the simplest sense of the idea. To put it more professionally, I like to think of resilience in an organizational or enterprise setting as the ability to provide whatever your core function or service is regardless of any adverse conditions. So to put it in a digital sense, Facebook or Meta's primary core service is to allow for the connections of people via social media. And no matter what happens, a resilient Meta is a Meta that can do that despite a bad actor on the internet attempting to disrupt that. And it's never always perfect, but to my mind, if you can provide whatever your core service is, regardless of the wind, rain, hail, sleet, and snow, think the traditional US Postal Service, any weather, anytime, that is a resilient organization. To me, is the fundamental definition of resilience.
I love it. I love it, CJ. And what I like the most is that you didn't necessarily use the reference. Everyone always uses the reference about bouncing back. And Ashley knows that I tend to stress what I view as the two pillars of resilience, which are adaptation and transformation. So I think when we just say, bouncing back is kind of the goal of resilience, that it kind of misses something important, right? Because true resilience is about transformation, which is about bouncing forward. So really, really liked how you framed that.
I agree, and I think sometimes conversations around resilience tend to focus too much on the recovery and not enough on the ability to keep on operating while you get to a point of recovery. And sometimes it focuses way too much on like the bad thing that could happen and not actually accounting for the thing that you can do because bad things are going to happen all the time. And yes, you should prepare for that, but that should not be your only focus when it comes to resilience.
That's right. And it's about the growth. It's the growth that happens afterwards as well. So that's the transformational piece. So yeah, absolutely. Love it. Love it.
I think the difference in perspectives is one of the things that we see in resilience and why we always ground with that question because resilience brings in so many different disciplines. Therefore, you have so many different perspectives. So, fully agree with you there, CJ, too. Um, Another question in terms of grounding I would like to ask is when you think about community cybersecurity, what do you think that means beyond the technical layer?
So I personally think there's an overemphasis on the technical layer when talking about cybersecurity, in part because of how ubiquitous the technology has become. I think there is overemphasis on the tech layer, in part because so much of what we think about when we think about cyber is typically couched or framed from the perspective of an enterprise organization. The thing that often gets overlooked is no matter how you slice it, no matter how you think about it, there's a human somewhere in the mix of all the digital technology that we have, whether there's a human operating the system, a human implementing the system, a human using the system as the end user. And because so much of the language in cybersecurity right now tends to focus on technical solution, we often overlook the human element. So from a community perspective, I like to think about cybersecurity at that layer 8 level. And when I say layer 8, for my cyber professionals that may be listening to this is a reference to the OSI model of computer technology, which traditionally there's only 7 layers, which starts at the very physics-based layer of the physical data layer all the way up through what we call the application layer, which is what most of us are used to looking at. It's your operating system, it's your apps that you use on your phone, whatever the case may be. But above that layer 7 is what some of us like to joke about is layer 8, and that's the human layer. But we use that model as a way to think about where we need to apply security best practices to make our systems more secure. And people tend to ignore layer 8, the people layer. But I would argue that not only is the layer that includes the humans that are implementing, using, benefiting from the system the most important layer, but they're also typically your weakest link. So when you're thinking about community cybersecurity, you also have to account for at the community level, when you look outside your window, every single person that you're looking at is probably carrying a computer in their pocket that is more powerful than any computer that we had at the start of the 2000s era. Never mind that most of the places that we are walking around, driving around, has some sort of digital technology that we have to interact with, whether or not we are actively deciding to do so. And then you add on top of that, that most of the functions that we rely on in our communities are supported by some sort of digital technology. So when I think about that, I tend to dispense with the hyper focus on a technical solution to what is largely a technical problem. I tend to focus more on at the community level, how can we actually help the people who are going to be most impacted from a technological failure that is could be a cyber attack or could be someone accidentally unplugged the wrong router somewhere. So when I think about that community cybersecurity component, to me, less emphasis on the technology, which some cyber folks are going to roll their eyes at, more emphasis on the people. Because at the end of the day, that's all that really matters. What is this technology for, if not to serve a human somewhere, somehow, right? So that's where I usually come from it, or come to this particular problem from the perspective of the people who are ultimately going to be using and impacted by this tech.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, CJ. I think from my position, especially as a community leader in emergency management for the city of Fort Worth, when a cyber disruption happens, the community, they don't experience it as a technical failure, for instance, right? They experience it as water not flowing or services not working or information they can't trust. So that means that community cybersecurity is really like community resilience in digital form. I think this is the way I view it, and I think the challenge for leaders is translating those invisible threats into something that people can understand without kind of overwhelming them.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and I think there's great case studies. Great's not the right word, but case studies from municipalities across the U.S. that bears out exactly what you've said, John. You can look at the ransomware attack that hit Baltimore a few years ago, where there tends to be the focus on the cost to the city of Baltimore for recovery, but the part that I thought required or should have had more emphasis was the cost to people and families in Baltimore who could not do the things to they needed to do in their daily lives because of a cyber incident. There were folks who couldn't pay their water bill and therefore had their water shut off, not because they failed to pay their water bill, but because a ransomware attack prevented them from using the system that they would have otherwise used to pay a bill that they had to pay. And as a result, they lost service. Not their fault, nothing they could do about it at their level, but not part of the conversation typically had when we talk about this. So I do think that more emphasis and credence needs to be given to how it actually impacts the end user. Because to your point, John, they're not necessarily going to care why it happened. All they're going to care about is how does it get fixed and how long are they going to have to wait for this disruption to their life to end?
Absolutely, absolutely, great point.
I think that's a really good point, especially when you look at risk and traditional risk equations where you look at consequences. But what you're talking about is like not only the consequence of loss, but like the just general community impact, which is not easily defined, but definitely should be a figure when you're looking at issues of community resilience.
I agree. And you're right. It's not easily defined, but that's a bit of an irony in this particular field. Being able to define the true loss of a cyber incident is not something that we are good at. Even when we talk typically in terms of financial loss, which is how we typically like to talk about the impact of a cyber incident, we're not even particularly good at truly calculating the financial loss an organization experiences from a cyber incident. And that's before we even account for the end users who are probably more impacted than the organization that owns the technology that suffered a breach or suffered a ransomware attack or what have you. Um, and that is partly because of how ubiquitous and how distributed digital technology is and how much it's part of our everyday lives that it makes it very difficult to identify what is a relevant data point for what is impact and what is not. But I do think the way that society we have chosen to even immediately approach how we assess the impact of a cyber incident, which is typically only in terms of dollars and only typically in terms of the dollars an organization had to spend or ultimately lost from the breach, is a problem in and of itself. We could better define the impact of cyber and account for what happens to you or I when whatever community that we're living in and the government in question responsible for governing that community experiences some sort of cyber incident. But we've collectively decided that the most important metric is monetary and not human dignity, suffering, disruption to daily life. And that partly because that's not an easy thing to measure. Like, how do you measure the person who can't pay their water bill, not because they failed to pay their water bill, but because of a cyber breach? What's the measurement for that? I'm not 100% sure, but I'm sure somebody could figure that out if we really wanted to.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the diverse viewpoint, CJ. So along those lines, cyber readiness, it really isn't any different from locking your doors or preparing for severe weather. Um, with that being said, how do you explain cybersecurity risks without creating fear?
So that's always a tough question. And I'm not even sure that at this point I still even have a great answer. What I have done with my own family when I talk about these things is actually help them think through the implications of the failures of the technology they have chosen to adopt in their lives and just have honest conversations about the the risk reward that they might be introducing by adopting a specific piece of technology or using a specific piece of technology in a certain way. And I tend to avoid the hyperbole. If you've worked in the cyber field, we all have a saying or an acronym that we love to throw about that there's an entire industry in cybersecurity that survives for no other reason than FUD. FUD being fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Because most people don't really understand digital technology, to include the organizations that are adopting it, or at least the decision makers in that organization, if you can scare them enough or make them feel uncertain enough, you can probably convince them to buy your product, which is great if you're selling cybersecurity software or some sort of cybersecurity service. Not super great if you're trying to get friends, family, your community to take a more active look at what their risks might be and take action. So I try for those folks to bring it closer to home when I'm with my mom and she may have an at-home assistant, or I'm with my cousins and they may have the new um, like the new wearable technology. We always tend to have these conversations about that's a great piece of technology. It does a lot of interesting things that we couldn't have otherwise done. But the question becomes, how much do you care about this potential consequence if it happens? And I try to avoid lecturing folks, and especially at the community level, that is the thing that never really is helpful. Is like nobody wants to lecture. We're all getting lectured all the time about things we should and should not do. But when it comes to convincing the folks around me to maybe take more seriously their cyber risks, it's just couching it in a way that they will actually care about. You've got your home assistant, and maybe that helps you. Maybe you love to use it for your music. Maybe you love to use it to get information while you're cooking, whatever the case may be. But there are not insignificant privacy risks to a lot of the digital technologies that we have that are consumer facing. Take the Ring doorbell, for instance, when you mentioned locking your doors as a risk mitigation measure. The internet capable camera doorbells are a risk mitigation measure, which, you know, if that makes you feel more secure in your home, and that is your right, you should absolutely get one of those. And I don't want to lecture anybody on that, but I would also ask you to consider, like, what are you giving up by having that? or what other risks have you introduced into your life by having that connected camera, that connected home device, and to focus on like the connected security cameras, for instance, that's a significant privacy risk, not just for you, but everybody else who lives in your community. I think the statistic recently releases that an average person will walk past 30 different cameras any given day, any day of the week, just from walking around their neighborhood, going to the store, going to work, coming back home, you've passed through a camera. And a lot of those cameras are not particularly secure, for a number of reasons, partly because they're so small that they only have so much computing power. And so they can only handle so much security protocol software, et cetera. So just by virtue of it being small enough to be a tiny thing in your home that you don't think about also introduces risks that maybe you care about, maybe you don't, but you can only care about it if you actually are aware there's a risk there. And that's how I tend to focus on talking about cyber risks to folks who are not at an enterprise level, who don't necessarily care about
Yeah.
organizational impacts is, do you even recognize there's a risk here at all? And can you make an informed decision after you recognize it? And that's step one.
Yeah. Yeah, I would have to agree with that. It's all about messaging. I think fear-based messaging tends to paralyze people somewhat, and empowerment tends to motivate them. So when people feel that they have agency, that fear kind of declines and then resilience will grow. So agree with that. Messaging is such a huge part of that.
I think that's a great point, and I think I'm going to take forward that exact description. Is it's an empowerment message. It's giving them the knowledge that they may not have necessarily had to empower them to make an informed decision about their own security. Because sometimes, like, to your point, I did not start in this field, so I can very much empathize with how often fear can be used to paralyze, not even on purpose, but when you start thinking about computer technology, I am fully aware of how esoteric cybersecurity specifically and computers in general can be. Some of that is on accident, some of that is by design. And as a result, people just kind of throw their hands up and let the digital winds take them wherever. But when you help the folks around you understand, um, a little bit better about how their tech works and a little bit better about how it doesn't work and the implications therein, they are now empowered to decide, do I really want the internet capable security camera outside, or maybe I don't actually like the new risk that I've introduced by trying to mitigate a completely separate risk.
I just want to say that I love this discussion because I think you're talking about making communities smarter by thinking about the decisions that they're making. And I think one of the takeaways that I have from this discussion already is framing something in the context of, are you making a consumer decision that's also a privacy decision? And I think that that's something that people don't really think about when you're thinking about a Ring or an Alexa or any kind of a device. It's much more of a consumer decision of, how does this make my life easier, and not a privacy decision on, as you said, what am I giving up or what am I introducing into my neighborhood or community. Um, so I really appreciate that. Um, so this is kind of the, like you said, every day you're passing through 30 cameras. Also a very, very sobering statistic. So I appreciate that as always in all of our conversations, CJ. Um, but let's talk about a crisis. So in a crisis, what makes a message trustworthy from the public's perspective?
So, in my experience, making a method or a message that is trustworthy, no matter what you're even talking about, whether it's cyber incidents, natural disasters, man-made, what have you, usually the variables that matter for messaging trustworthiness is right story, right communicator, right channel, and right time. If you can align those 4 things, and I speak about those 4 things very broadly, but if you can align those 4 things with the audience that you were trying to communicate with, that's what's gonna make your message trustworthy. You've gotta say the right thing, so just like what we were talking about, it's not really helpful to lecture your neighbor about the cyber implications of their Ring camera. Like, they're gonna think you're a crazy person, and also, like, it is their money, their house, they have a right to do whatever they wanna do with it, regardless of the implications for everybody around them about that software. So you've gotta first have the right message. Um, but even with the right message, if it's coming out of the wrong face, it's not gonna do you a whole lot of good. Like, there's plenty of examples across the US right now of right message, facts, truth, etc., all being ignored because the wrong person is the one saying it, or they're not saying it on the right channel, or they're saying it to the wrong audience because the audience they're saying it to is like, yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying, but I can't do a damn thing about it. So you're not actually achieving anything, or you're saying it, but you're still saying it on, say, FM radio, which maybe that's the right audience for a certain demographic, but maybe you need to be on TikTok or Blue Sky or Discord or, I'm sure there's a channel right now that I'm not aware of because I am now an elder millennial and I can't keep up with them all anymore. But my point is like your message can be true and have internal logical consistency and be on its face trustworthy, but that's not how humans work. We trust things that are consistent with what we already want to believe. And this is not a cynical statement. This is just sociological, psychological science is that all of us tend to trust things that are consistent with our existing beliefs and worldviews. And part of what creates those are the communication channels we use, the people that we already trust, and the stories that we already want to believe. If I talk to um, my family in Trinidad and it's coming from me and I tell them something, they're more likely to trust me than if I grab, a random employee from the cybersecurity infrastructure security agency and have them go tell my family that. Um, they may be more technically accurate in what they're describing than I am, but they probably are not saying it in a way that my family is going to resonate with. They might not be saying it on the channel that my family is going to be listening to, and they just inherently have not built the level of trust in my family or my community that maybe I have. And that is true for me going into a different community and waxing poetic about cybersecurity.
Yeah. And perhaps CJ, most importantly, I think trust grows when multiple voices reinforce the same message, right? So when you have alignment, especially if it's community based, right? When you have alignment across all the different voices that are speaking, it signals stability, and I think that's a key point to make for communities.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And as I think about that, that is generally true. There is a theory of the case in communication psychology and strategic communication in general that that's not always the case, and sometimes um, more signals saying the same thing can result in some audiences just hunkering down on what they already want to believe. Well, use climate change as an example. This is a resilience podcast, and climate change is one of the biggest factors in community risk and resilience that we can talk about. Um, and like the science is pretty consistent. I'm sure scientists make mistakes and sometimes have to update their models. But there's a lot of people all saying the exact same thing, and yet that has not necessarily moved some audiences to believe it,
Right.
even when it comes from multiple communicators who, aside from their um, their views on climate change have nothing else in common. It just hardens people to the message. So
Right.
it's an interesting communication
Absolutely.
challenge where
I,
where that
I
tipping point sometimes is depending on the subject.
Yeah, and I think that that example you gave is still a good example, I think, for what both of us are saying. But that that was one group of folks that were trying to reinforce the message, but there's a whole other group, that's kind of working against that. So
Yeah.
again, it's really about every having that alignment and across all signals, right? But yeah, no, great point, great discussion. So along those lines, we talk about transparency. How do you balance transparency with avoiding panic?
So transparency, especially in this field, has always been a little bit difficult, not because people shouldn't be transparent in in the cyber realm, um, but because of how esoteric it can be. Like if, for example, the folks at Equifax were super transparent about the breach that happened to them back in 2017 and gave all the information that they had at their disposal. Put a pin in whether or not that would have actually been not super great for the executives, but I'm not 100% sure anybody really would have understood like the scope of the issue for no other reason than like the layers of digital technology that we all rely on at this point, even when you can parse them out, like sometimes they have just such goofy names that the words that are used to identify a problem mean absolutely nothing to the layperson because there's a special language that one has to know to even understand first and foremost. But that need to balance transparency without freaking everybody out or without amplifying misinformation. It starts with speed, accuracy, empathy, and the willingness to admit when mistakes happen. Um, and I'll start with the speed bit, and I don't mean speed for the sake of saying whatever without any validating data or information. But I will say my experience has been not just in cybersecurity, but across the board when it comes to the story that people believe about a thing that is happening is often shaped by the first story they've heard about that thing to begin with. In fact, that's a whole principle in psychological operations and misinformation, propaganda, counter propaganda. Is sometimes the first person to publish a story is the authority on that story. Uh, when it comes to a cyber incident, the reality is, just like with any incident, if something has happened and there's enough awareness that something is happening, that people start to ask questions, your options are you can tell your story or you can let other people speculate and tell your story for you and then try to correct the record after the fact. I can tell you from experience, option 2 is the worst possible thing you can try to do because it's much harder to convince someone to change their mind after they've been fed information that may be accurate or may not be accurate. So speed
Yeah.
is one of the most important things um, when trying to balance transparency with misinformation. Because if you are third or even second to get the story out about you, doesn't matter how transparent you're being sometimes, people just might not believe you. They might assume
Yeah.
your story is the lie and the first story they heard is truth. Um, the other is trying to be as accurate as possible as you are legally allowed to be. And I won't belabor this point like that. This is a pretty self-explanatory variable in transparency is the more accurate information you can give, the more truthful information you give, the more
Yeah.
transparent you are being by definition.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. I think we have to focus on communication that reduces ambiguity. Typically, from my experience, panic usually grows in information vacuums, and if you communicate early, that you mentioned this as well, communicate early, clearly, and consistently. Even if you don't have all the answers, right, you still prevent that speculation from kind of filling the gaps.
Exactly, and sometimes that is part of transparency is just being honest when you don't have all the answers. Um, more often than not, when it comes to a cyber breach, the person who's communicating to the public about the breach is not the person who's managing the incident response. Like, the person managing the incident response needs to do that and does not have necessarily time to talk to every reporter or every customer. But there's someone in the organization who, if you have done your cyber risk management correct, is responsible for that external communication, the internal stakeholder communication, the public relations, all of that. And that person may not have all the information that the cyber incident response commander has, and that's okay. You just be upfront about that from the start. Is like, there's going to be a lag between what I can communicate to an external stakeholder, um, than what may be actually happening right this second in the course of mitigating this particular cyber incident. And then the other two parts of the transparency equation is always remembering, like, you may think this is a technical problem when you're communicating externally, but it is more likely than not that there are actual human beings being impacted by this thing. And your ability to not, like, pretend empathy, but to actually have empathy for what it might be like for the downstream victim of a cyber breach, to be able to empathize with what they're going through as you shape your message to them, goes a long way in not only making your message actually transparent, but creating the perception that your message is transparent. And the truth is sometimes the only thing that really matters is whether or not the people you're communicating to perceive the message to be as transparent as you're trying to make it. And often the best way to do that is to have and demonstrate empathy for what they might be going through in this moment. And then the last piece of this is the willingness to admit when mistakes were made, and that is part of being able to tell your external, internal audience, whomever, that you may not always have the information up front, or being honest and saying, when I talked to you an hour ago, the information I had and the assumptions I had to make led to this conclusion. But what we found with more information, with more time, is actually this. And being comfortable that, like, people aren't going to be thrilled necessarily when you do that, but that's better than you pretending like that is not actually happening and then doubling down on your incorrect message to begin with, because once that becomes apparent, then
Oh yeah.
you've lost all credibility and
Oh yeah.
transparency is out the window.
Absolutely. I'm sure there's a ton of PIO professionals across the nation that may be listening to this right now and wishing that they could jump in the conversation, because I know this is their background and expertise, and I'm sure we're saying a lot of things that's resonating with them. Ashley, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, what resonates to me is thinking about some of the incidents that happened while CJ and I were working together. And, you know, in terms of the consequences, um, I think about the information that goes to the people who are the operators, the people who are the victims, and then the population at risk, and how often those are different groups with different needs and challenges and, levels of information that they need, but also how much that population at risk can sort of grow and expand depending on the type of attack, but then also contract too. And some of that is the challenge for a PIO is how to not create a panic or the actions that that population at risk may take. And I think about that within, a specific incident. And CJ, I'm thinking of like Colonial
Yeah.
Pipeline. And the idea of people panic buying gas. And who was the actual population at risk? What was the actual risk? And how that sort of grew over time and the actions that were taken, and who the victims actually were. So, for any listeners who may not be familiar with Colonial, it's a very interesting case to Google with your device. That's probably you probably have some privacy concerns about now. Um,
Yeah. You bring up Colonial, and Colonial is one of those things that always makes my brain hurt a little bit because I think this is a great case study in what happens when one, people are not being honest about the technology involved. Two, the organization involved is maybe not communicating as well as they possibly could be. And the fear, uncertainty, and doubt issue that extends beyond the organization into the population. Because
Mhm,
Colonial Pipeline is one of those case studies where, like, even today, sometimes it'll come up in large cyber events or conversation with other cyber professionals as a case study in the implications of the convergence of what we think of as digital technology, mainstream computer technology, and what is called operational technology, which often uses very similar um, physics in its technology. Like, some people might still understand it as a computer, but in reality, it is much simpler, but in many ways more complex than your desktop computer, and is responsible for industrial systems. And I make that distinction because Colonial Pipeline and the run on gas we had because of that was because of a combination of esoteric technology and not super great crisis communication plans. So what you may find if you do go Google this is some people will say it's like, oh, this is an example of cyber actors disrupting critical infrastructure. And that's true on its surface, but that misrepresents the scope of what actually happened. Because when some people read that, they think like, oh, somebody used a computer to disrupt some industrial control process. And like, no, what actually happened, memory serves us, some bad actors actually got into the billing system at Colonial Pipeline. In
mhm.
an abundance of caution, senior leaders at Colonial decided to shut down the flow of gas, not because there was a bit of malware somewhere in the technology that controls the flow of gas, but because there was some concern that maybe there could be because of the malware that hit their billing system that isn't really that different than like a billing system at any other large organization. It was nowhere near, from what I understand, any of their industrial control processes. But because there wasn't a super great communication plan, and because how esoteric this technology can be, a bunch of people made a bunch of assumptions that to this day kind of still live as quote unquote truth about what actually happened in Colonial Pipeline. When in reality, like, it was a human who decided to shut down the flow of gas, not the actual cyber incident itself that shut down the flow of gas. And that decision, that impact, and that communication failure, for lack of a better word, resulted in a pretty boilerplate cyber incident to result in a bunch of um, average Americans taking a run on gas. And like, that is an excellent example of what can happen when we don't do the best job of assessing the impact on everyday people, only looking at it as an enterprise technical problem, and then not doing a great job of communicating.
Yeah,
All
exactly,
right.
and again, that's one of those things where the messaging to operators and the actual victims being colonial and the population is, those needs are very different, because, like you said, taking a run on gas, it meant that there were impacts to communities up and down the East Coast, um, so
And if I can add just really quickly, like, to be sure, Colonial Pipeline was the victim of a cyber attack. But as I've grown in this field, I've started to recognize that who we call the victims of a breach are often not the actual victims in the way that actually matters. And I'm going to focus on Equifax, and I'm not the first person to talk about this. I won't be the last person to talk about it. Pick Your Cyber podcast. They have an entire series on it, I'm sure. But Equifax got breached, had a bunch of data stolen, et cetera, et cetera. And they are often described as the victim of that breach. But like, are they though? Like, the consequences to them, the cost to them from recovery, and the the cost of the regulatory impact to them, like, versus the profits that they made in that year, like, they still walked away making a profit. Meanwhile, that was maybe the 3rd time that the entire data that is CJ was lost in a breach. The first time was when OPM got hacked and I just finished my top secret clearance and then they lost it, all the data for a bunch of us who all had secret clearances, then OPM. So, like, at a certain point, like, who's the real victim here? The folks at Equifax who still run away with the golden parachute and profit, or, the engineer downstream who got scapegoated, and then the rest of the Americans whose data, who had no choice in the matter, had their privacy impacted by something that they had no choice in whatsoever but to have their data in the system. They don't choose to have their data consumed by Equifax and used for the sake of Equifax's business or any other credit scoring business. That is something that is imposed on them. And the only thing that anybody who was a victim downstream of that breach got was like life alert, or not life alert. I'm probably sorry. That is for older folks. A life
The
tag.
victim is, the community, and I think you
Exactly.
mean, like a credit monitoring thing.
Yeah, we
I
all
don't know
got,
the
like,
name
you've got
myself.
3 months of credit monitoring, spoiler alert, provided to you by Equifax, and you only get it for 3 months, and, like, by the by, if you were like me, where this might have been, like, the 3rd time that the data that is essentially your life got unauthorized access by a bad actor, like, cool. 3 months of data monitoring for my various accounts is great, I suppose, except this is the 3rd time that somebody's offered me that. So at what point am I or you or everybody who is wrapped up in that the actual victims and not the people who still basically make billions of dollars off of something that we don't even get to choose whether or not we want to participate in?
Yeah, this is a great discussion, and that's kind of a cautionary tale, I think, for all of our listeners as well as community members. Um, but I wanted to kind of pivot a little bit and CJ ask, what's one thing, if you had one thing to share, what's one thing communities could do today to strengthen cyber readiness?
So this is not a sexy one thing, but enable multi-factor authentication on whatever devices are capable of enabling that function. Um, I'm not the first person to probably say this out loud to you. Matter of fact, I know for a fact I'm not the first person. It comes up all the time. Um, put it on, you know, activate multi-factor authentication on your bank accounts. Activate it for the devices in your home that are capable of having some sort of multi-factor authentication enabled for your emails. Um, and this is not only for like personal accounts, but if you are a municipal employee, community employee, nonprofit organization, anybody who's responsible or has some sort of connection with the community which you live in and serve. Like, this is one of the lowest hanging fruits that you could do literally right now after you're done listening to this, is just to enable, or if it has been enabled and you found a way to circumvent that, to stop doing that. Because it takes a couple of extra seconds. And like, not all multi-factor authentication tools are created equal, but I would argue that more often than not, any MFA is better than no MFA. So activate it for your bank account, activate it for your utilities, activate it for your social medias, activate it for your emails. It, every system that you're using right now, every online application that you're using, there's a good chance it'll give you the option to have this thing. And it can be as simple as like a text message to your phone where you just click yes and then you're in. And like, it's a couple of extra seconds, which, you may think is annoying now, but I suppose it'll it's probably less annoying than realizing that someone got into your bank account and drained all your funds, and now you're dealing with that, or
Right.
stole your identity, and now you're
Absolutely.
dealing with somebody charging up a credit card in your name, and that takes way longer to fix than dealing with an SMS text message as your solution to MFA.
Oh, absolutely. I think what I'm hearing from you, CJ, is that we should treat cyber preparedness as community safety and not IT policy, right?
Correct. 100% that is the if nothing else gets taken away from this conversation, it's to dispense with the idea that cybersecurity is just a computer problem for computer people, and recognize that cybersecurity is an every person problem, because if you have a cell phone in your pocket, guess what? You probably have enough digital technology that you're interacting with in your life that if something goes sideways, you will notice. And it'll impact you more than it will impact the people that manufactured your device or the software that you're using.
Well said. Um, I do have a final question that hopefully will end us on a positive note and not scare our listeners too much, as we've been talking
Right.
about some of the threats and histories of attacks that I hope we're not racing to have people look up Equifax and Colonial Pipeline. But I want to end on
It's such a serious conversation, Ashley. It really. So we need to line it up.
it's it is serious, but I do think this touches every community. And so I want to end with our final question of CJ, when you think about the future of community cybersecurity, what gives you actual hope?
So I really love this question, and I hope this ends on a positive note. It might not be positive if you consider yourself to be a tech evangelist, but for the rest of us, I am anecdotally starting to see a trend where I think more and more people are starting to value like lived experiences over what is happening online, and that's probably for a number of reasons. But in part, like I think in the post rise of Facebook, Meta, Twitter, more and more people are realizing that what the lives that people depict online are probably not an accurate depiction of what they're actually doing. So one should always take it with a grain of salt. And then, the rise of generative AI with the release of ChatGPT a few years ago, which just allows more people to pump out more online content. Um, I think more and more people are disengaging from the cyberspace, and not in like the Luddite sort of way that some tech folks like to talk about people disconnecting from the internet, but in the sense that like, and I'll use my hobbies for example. I love music. I love playing guitar. I love to sing. Um, should anybody ever pay me a living wage to do that? I mean, I'll say yes because I would love that. But like, I'm a good guitar player. I am not one that you're gonna skip Bad Bunny to see. But I go on this particular tangent to say, but there is an open question with the advent of something like Suno, where people can write and produce a song that one might consider better than anything that I could produce right now in seconds, and then release it on the internet. So why even bother learning to sing, learning to play the guitar, or doing any of that? Um, and to me, that's a defeatist question that I never really engaged with. But then I'm realizing like there's a lot of people that are not really engaging with that and saying, screw it, because I would rather see someone play guitar imperfectly live than listen to, you know, some random person who I will never meet and never actually see perform any of this stuff, their Suno playlist. And that's not for everybody, but I'm seeing that phenomenon more and more. And the secondary effect of that, ironically, is maybe we are seeing more and more people think about the implications of the technology that they have in their lives. I'm seeing more and more people ask, like, there was a point in all of our waking memories where I didn't care to know the accurate number of steps I'd taken in a day. But for some reason, that became a statistic that I cared about for a second, only to kind of come full circle with the rise of Gen I. I'd ask, like, do I actually care about how many steps I've taken a day or how many calories estimated my workout burned? Or does it matter that I did the workout or walked the 2 miles or ran? And I think as more people are starting to think about this, digital technology becomes less and less a core part of everyone's daily life, which does reduce your digital footprint and by extension, your digital risk. So that actually, for me, is a good thing. Like, and we kind of are on very simply put two paths where like one path we all lean into the gen ai the artificial intelligence of it all and accept that everything that a human can do, an artificial intelligence can do too. And if you accept that, that is one way to look at the world. But the other direction is like, well, maybe this idea of quote unquote the dead internet theory, where there's more bots talking to other bots than there are actually humans engaging with content, humans will disengage. And that is not necessarily a bad thing because they're not just disengaging and then being raptured off the planet, they're disengaging and going to do something else that may not have computers involved at all, reducing their digital footprint and thus reducing their cyber risk. And I think that's probably more positive than we're willing to admit as a society sometimes.
I would have to agree with you, CJ. I think what gives me hope too is the shift toward collaboration and innovation across the generations. I mean, it's encouraging to see that communities are starting to see cyber resilience, I guess, as part of more everyday safety, and it's not just some abstract technology issue. I think at the end of the day, technology, it's changing the battlefield, but trust is always going to win the day and be our greatest infrastructure.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. And I think as as more people start to not recognize that, because I believe everybody's always recognized that, but recognize that there are other ways to build that trust infrastructure in a way that is not necessarily tied to what you might read online. I think that'll ultimately be better for the vast majority of us.
I
Agreed.
do confess. So I do have to confess, I care about the steps that I'm taking. Uh, but after this, I also care about where those steps are being tracked as I'm getting them in for the day. Um, and I think that you took a topic that usually makes people, this is not a technology joke, but it usually makes people short circuit. And we I am starting and ending with a joke. But it
Another
normally
dad
makes
joke.
people.
Another dad joke.
Seriously.
I didn't say the bit. I didn't. But we have tried to turn this conversation into something that's grounded and human and maybe just a little bit fun to talk about. So I think we really appreciate CJ you coming on and taking the time to explain some of these ideas in a little bit more detail. At the end of the day, I think our guiding principle here is community, and a community can't change what it doesn't understand. So you made cyber feel a little bit less mysterious, and a lot more connected to our everyday lives. And I think we will absolutely have you back. So consider this your official warning to come back. So.
Well, I had a grand old time and I had a lot of fun. So hopefully your audience has a bit of fun too. And if I can leave you all with one last thing, yes, I totally get it that computer technology, cybersecurity might make you short circuit. I would argue for the vast majority of people listening, that is not because they are not capable of learning this field, is only because in this field, we spent so much time making the language impenetrable that it seems harder than it actually is. I will say the dirty secret about computer technology, as I've learned as someone who did not start in this field, is most of what you don't know is in part because the language being used is weird. And once you get through that, definitely some complicated stuff in here, but very accessible, and I would challenge everybody to, maybe take a crack at learning a little bit more about the way the technology you use every day works. And also, please, please, please don't tar and feather me about the Suno or the steps comment. I am not judging anybody for any of that. I totally get it if you love all of those things or none of those things, but just food for thought. So anyway, I'm very glad to be here, and thank you so much for allowing me to talk at you for a while.